Hello, everyone. My name is Maya, and my teammates Emmanuel, Francis, Jairus, and Yosef, and myself will talk about DC statehood today. We will talk about DC history, why DC statehood is important for DC, and its factors of why DC doesn't have its statehood status. DC statehood is a topic that myself and my teammates are very vocal and passionate about Washington, DC, and for us to gain DC statehood.
Hello everyone, my name is Yosef and I'll be talking about the history of DC statehood. This story goes back to the very beginning of the United States. When the country was created, the founders decided that Washington DC should be a special city that belongs to the whole country, not just one state. Because of that decision, people living in Washington DC lost their right to vote for the Congress in 1801. So even though DC residents pay tax, work in government jobs, and serve in the military, they had no voting power in the national decisions. This is where the idea of taxation without representation came from. Over time, DC residents pushed for more rights, and in 1961, they finally gained the right to vote for president. This was a big step, but still didn't give them voting for a member of Congress. In 1973, DC receives a home rule which allowed people in the city to elect their own mayor and city council. This gave the community more control over local issues, but Congress still has the power to block or change DC law whenever it wants. As years went on, more people start demanding full right of DC residents. The modern push for DC statehood grew stronger, especially as the population increased and more realized unfairness of the situation. A major moment happened in 2021 when the House of Representatives passed a bill to make DC the 51st state. The bill didn't pass the Senate side, but it showed that the movement has made a real progress in the being taken more seriously than ever before. Today, over 700,000 people live in DC, more than some entire states, and still don't have the voting representation of Congress.
Taxation without representation, the fight for DC statehood. Good morning, everyone. Today, I want to talk about something that affects the place many of us live in, but a lot of people do not fully understand DC statehood. I want to start with the phase we all learn in history class. No taxation without representation. This idea goes back to the American Revolution when the colonists was angry about being taxed by the government. They had no voice, but here's the ironic part. Over 200 years later, people living in DC still dealing with the same problem. What exactly is DC statehood? So, DC statehood actually means basically is the idea that Washington DC should become the 51st state, so the residents have full political rights just like other states. Right now, DC have over 700,000 residents, which is more than some states, but DC still have no voting rights, no voting member in Congress, no senators, only one voting delegate in the House. So, DC residents pay federal taxes, serve in the military, and follow federal laws, but they do not have a real vote in Congress. That's why people say DC still is living on a taxation without representation. DC was created in 1970 by a federal district to not be part of any state. The idea was to keep the capital neutral, so no single state have much influence. Originally, people living in DC could vote as Maryland or Virginia residents, but in 1801, Congress passed a law that gave them full coverage of the city and took away everyone's voting rights in Congress. In 1961, the 23rd Amendment finally let DC residents to vote for a president. Then in 1973, the Home Rule Act allowed DC to elect their own government and city council. But today, Congress still overruled DC laws even control the DC budget. The recent push for statehood. In the last decade, the movement has grown a lot. In 2020 and 2021, the House actually passed a bill to make DC the 51st state. Did not make it through the Senate, though, but it's the biggest progress in history. Why DC statehood matter? People support DC argue that DC residents deserve the same rights as everybody else. A real vote in Congress, local control of their own laws, and taxation without representation. Supporters see it a simple fairness issue for you are U.S. citizens and should have representation.
My name is Frances Crawford, and I will be talking about the pros and cons of DC statehood. The debate over Washington, D.C. statehood involves arguments about voting rights and fair representation versus constitutional intent and political balance. Proponents emphasize civil rights and equality, while opponents cite the Founding Fathers' vision for a federal district and the political implications of adding a new state. Supporters argue that D.C. should be a state because its over 700,000 residents are American citizens who pay federal taxes and can be sent to war, yet they lack full representation in Congress, having only delegates and no voting senators. Statehood would grant them the same full voting rights as residents of the 50 states. D.C. residents pay more per capita in federal taxes than any state and more total federal taxes than 22 other states, but they have no say in how those funds are spent by Congress. The 23rd Amendment allows them to vote in presidential elections, but this is insufficient compared to representation granted to citizens in states. The Constitution may limit statehood due to its specifications for the federal district, but a proposed House bill suggested a solution by shrinking the federal district to just the National Mall and granting statehood to the remainder of the city, setting a historical precedent for altering district boundaries. This proposal supports the belief that all citizens deserve representation in Congress. As a federal district, DC's local laws and budgets are subject to congressional review and interference. Statehood would grant D.C. full control over its own local affairs, including its criminal justice system and public safety. They also argue that denying statehood is a civil and racial injustice, as D.C. has a significant minority population that is currently disenfranchised. The lack of representation disproportionately affects Black Americans, who make up a significant proportion of D.C.'s population. The call for statehood underlines the significance of addressing racial inequalities and ensuring a more representative democracy. There are some historical and political complexities surrounding D.C. statehood, though. Historically, Virginia opposed statehood partially due to fear of losing the slave market and feeling neglected by the federal government. Current resistance to D.C. gaining full rights is attributed to political balance, where Republicans fear Democratic gain. Mayor Muriel Bowser has consistently rejected proposals for retrocession to Maryland, emphasizing a desire for statehood. Creating a new state requires congressional approval, but is complicated by majority Senate rules. Legal challenges to any changes in D.C.'s status are anticipated, especially with a Republican majority in the Supreme Court. In efforts to achieve D.C. statehood, Democrats are overlooking significant practical and legal challenges. Their proposal to create a new state while keeping a small federal district would require a constitutional amendment, raise constitutional ambiguities, and result in a highly partisan state with no Republican representation. Ultimately, the proposal aims to bypass the need for a constitutional amendment, but remains hassled with issues that have yet to be resolved. The Constitution specifies how land can become part of the District of Columbia, but is ambiguous about how it can be removed. Legal scholars debate whether land can be granted back, as historical instances of retrocession may not resolve contemporary disputes. Furthermore, Maryland's original grant of land complicates things because consent from Maryland may be necessary for state formation. Critics point to potential complications with the 23rd Amendment, stating that if the residential areas became a state and only a small federal district remained, the few remaining residents of the district, i.e., the president and his family, would still receive 3 electoral votes.
Hello, everyone. Today I'll be talking about DC statehood today and where it sits and stands. The struggle for statehood in Washington, D.C. has changed dramatically over time, reflecting both political advancement and rising national consciousness. In the past, citizens of Washington, D.C. had little influence over their own government and were governed by Congress. Congress directly oversaw the city laws, finances, and administration for a large portion of the 19th and 20th centuries, frequently neglecting local concerns. Congress persisted in overriding municipal decisions, obstructing policies on matters such as public health, taxation, and criminal justice, even after the 1973 Home Rule Act established an elected mayor and council. Efforts for statehood during the 1980s and 1990s were symbolically powerful but lacked widespread support, leaving residents with taxation without representation and limited democratic rights. The push for DC statehood is stronger and more apparent than it has ever been. The city has experienced political, economic, and demographic growth, and its citizens have launched tenacious campaigns demanding full representation. The U.S. House of Representatives has often approved modern statehood initiatives, and national discussions about racial fairness and voting rights have increased D.C.'s standing as a majority-minority city with limited political involvement. Although there are still political barriers to the statehood and Senate, D.C. has more support nationally, stronger coalitions, and clearer approaches than it has in its previous decades. Although the fight for equitable representation is still ongoing, the transition from a district under federal administration to a self-governing, politically engaged community represents significant achievement.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maya, and I will be talking about gentrification and racism and its impact on DC statehood. When it comes to granting statehood for Washington, D.C., the D.C. Council and native Washingtonians have faced not only challenges with obtaining statehood for Washington, D.C., but the Council and Elder Holmes Norton are facing changes to the D.C. racial population due to gentrification and facing underlying systemic racism. It has been no secret that Washington, D.C. has been named the Chocolate City and the Black Capital of America, but it will always have an unconscious impact on how D.C. gains statehood. Now, you may be wondering, how does gentrification in D.C. affect statehood? A gentrification is the process whereby the characters of a neighborhood changes throughout the influx of more affluent residents, gentrifiers, and transplanters, for example, and its investment. In D.C., gentrification started in the late 90s, early 2000s, but in the late 2000s to early 2010s, it saw a huge population boom. In the Georgetown Voice states, the unaffordability of housing has fueled the gentrification, which has uprooted thousands of residents in D.C. One study from the nonprofit Quarterly estimated that 20,000 Black residents were displaced from the district from 2000 to 2013 alone. This issue is very clear that gentrification was not only a change of population to D.C. natives, but bringing new faces of non-D.C. natives to Washington, D.C. area. But these people, who are often white and come from affluent families, often move into the historic D.C. neighborhoods such as Georgetown, 8th Street, DuPont Circle, and Anacostia without knowing the history of those neighborhoods or even the real history of D.C. from a native Washingtonian's knowledge. Not only these people are increasing the housing prices, but they're also expanding the growing number of people who will join the statehood movement. Transplanters and gentrifiers are often forget that D.C. is not a state once they realize more taxes than any other state in the U.S. and advocating for new laws to be passed in D.C. will be a longer process than other states. New incomers to D.C. will learn this and join the fight for D.C. statehood. However, the growing statehood movement has an unconscious racial bias towards Black natives of Washington, D.C., often derailing the fight for statehood and the issue that nobody wants to talk about. The D.C. Fiscal Policy Institute states, Black and brown people make up the majority of D.C. populations, making statehood a racial justice issue. putting a stop to Black communities, increasing the political engagement was the driving intention behind voter suppression in the period of following Reconstruction, and the legacy continues today. While DC has no votes in the Congress, elected officials from the 50 states have the power to interfere with local laws and significant consequences on the health and safety and well-being of DC residents. From the words of the members of Congress and the Senate, they feel as the DC Council and the government cannot properly run itself due to the crime rates and fluctuating throughout the years. Many will call Washington, D.C. murder capital to stereotype Black D.C. natives who are the most affected by the crack epidemic in the 1980s, as well as adding on to the growing number of the murder rates in the 1990s in Washington, D.C. But if D.C. gains full statehood, it will grant Washington, D.C. 3 electoral votes that will count towards the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives. D.C. will also have a senator, and the House of Representatives will have full power to vote for Washington, D.C. Statehood for D.C. will only mean that one of the largest Black American populations in America, besides Atlanta, Georgia, will gain full rights and control to run itself like any other state in the United States. But with a majority Black-led government, it was seen as a win for Black Americans. DC statehood now states, just as Black voters start to exercise their political power in D.C., Congress quickly replaced D.C.'s local government with federally appointed commissioners, blocking heavy Black regions from having full voters' rights or control over its local government. But in reality, Congress and the Senate and the federal commissioners for D.C. have the majority of control of Washington, D.C., making it harder for laws that would be beneficial to residents of D.C., and as well as approving the spending budget for D.C. The D.C. Fiscal Policy Institute states, because D.C. is not a state or located within one, it is in charge of many programs that the state would normally administer for its largest cities. These programs include Medicaid, unemployment, insurance, and more. While D.C. has more responsibilities than many cities, it has less autonomy over its budget and laws than any states do. Every law passed in the D.C. Council and signed by the mayor can be modified or rejected by the Congress. After D.C. leaders approve the budget, Congress has 30 days to reject and change it. After that period, D.C. has the authority to spend its local funds outlined in its budget. Congress also mandates a D.C. budget not only for its upcoming fiscal year, but for 4 years throughout the financial plan. Congress regularly interferes how D.C. gets and spends its own money. In closing, gentrification and racism is one of the biggest underlying issues and reasons on why Washington, D.C. does not have statehood today. The main causes are just a cause and effect of a system that's not only hurting the residents and D.C. natives who work here in D.C. every day, and benefiting those who are white, rich, and don't live in D.C., who are creating laws that will further control D.C.'s government and residents and the general Washingtonian natives. Without addressing these main issues, fighting for D.C. statehood will be losing a game of chess with a checkers strategy. Thank you for listening to our DC Statehood Podcast. I want to take the time to shout out my teammates for their hard work and contribution to our podcast. And don't forget to support our local DC government in the fight for statehood. Take care.